Hello to all of my snowbird friends, and even local ladies that, for whatever reason, get busy and cannot make it each week to this, our fourth or fifth lesson in the book of 1 Peter, still in chapter 1. I've really enjoyed, I can't speak for everybody else, but I've certainly enjoyed getting in deeply into 1 Peter and trying to understand the depths of Peter's relationship with the Lord. And so he shares this with us, and honestly, these first several verses that we've been looking at since the beginning of January have been pretty amazing to me and life-changing. But I started off in our notes this week with the question, how many words are there in the English language? Now, that's kind of a misleading question because it depends on which Google search you end up reading. But I guess the highest number I saw was 1 million plus a few. And so clearly, as I was reading, the English language has more words than any other language. And we have so many words that often mean the same thing, and then the one word that has so many different meanings, and so it's very confusing. And the point is that language can only take you so far. We are grateful that we have the ability to structure our thinking into words and to be able to express ourselves. But the point that we're going to see today is sometimes there just aren't enough words. There just isn't the ability to express what the heart feels. And another thing that I want to ask and delve into a little bit is some of the most difficult to understand words that we use, even among Christians and among people who talk about God. What are some of the most difficult to understand words? And of course, you can come up with all kinds of things like propitiation. I mean, not very many people use that word, but righteousness and holiness. There are just a lot of words that we use in religious circles that maybe we use them and don't really understand them. And we're going to be talking about a word today that I think can be very misunderstood and maybe even taken for granted. All right, so in the weeks past, we have looked at the first 12 verses of 1 Peter. And in those first 12 verses, Peter has just used words brilliantly to describe all the wonderful gifts that God has given us, the spiritual gifts. Not material gifts, but spiritual gifts. What is our heritage? What is our inheritance as followers of Jesus Christ? He has said things like we've been born again, we've been given hope, we have been given the resurrection from the dead, we have been given an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. And even when we're going through tough, difficult circumstances where we're suffering, we still have the hope that God plants within us for eternity with Him in heaven. And so as we get now to this next section, 13 and following, for several verses, it's almost as though Peter, as he starts this section, he starts it with the word therefore. And anytime we see the word therefore, as you've all heard the little quip, you have to go backwards to see what it's there for. And obviously, what has happened before is just this litany of wonderful things. So he's saying, in light of all the wonderful gifts that God has blessed us with, spiritual gifts that last into eternity, how should we act? What should we do? How should we respond? And so these verses will describe that for us. So let me read 1 Peter 1, 13 through 19. Therefore, prepare your minds for action and be sober-minded. Set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." And if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, then conduct yourselves with fear among the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. So there are a few words and phrases in that passage that might qualify for our list of being difficult to understand or grasp. I think the one that jumps out the quickest to most people is holy, where he says, "Be holy, because I'm holy." Another one is to conduct yourselves with fear. Okay, what's the deal about fear? Why would he want us to conduct ourselves with fear? I mean, after all, there's another verse in the Bible that says, perfect love casts out fear. And so that's pretty confusing to people to see that there's not supposed to be any fear. And now he says, conduct yourselves with fear. And so we'll have to examine that and see if we can understand a word that we think we know and we think we understand it. And in reality, we really don't. We have to understand the context. For today, though, I really want us to look and consider the word holy. Now, there are basically 4 commands given in these verses. Obviously, the one that I'm referring to, you shall be holy, for I am holy, or be holy, for I am holy. It's a command. You be holy, for I am holy. That's God speaking. Another command is don't be conformed to your former passions. Another command is set your hope fully on grace. And then finally, the one that we just mentioned, conduct yourselves with fear. Now, if we're just going to focus on the word holy here today, we got to spend some time understanding what it means when we say God is holy. I mean, it's one thing for us to have a command that says that we're to be holy. Okay, what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, he's already given us a little bit of a hint when he says we're to be holy in the same way or as I am holy. So there's a connection there between the holiness of God and what he's asking us to be. So we're going to delve into the holiness of God. We're going to take a stab at trying to define the holiness of God. And I hope that you will let your mind go there. Let your mind just think for a minute. What does the holiness of God mean? You know, probably a lot of us that were raised in the church, we remember that hymn, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. And that might be your only real acquaintance with the word holy. I was thinking this morning, not this morning, but the morning of I was teaching this, I had been to exercise class, and we had done just multiple sets of this one particular exercise that worked on the muscle, a muscle group. And as soon as it was over, I said, "Holy moly!" And I got tickled at myself because I think of the word holy as being a word that's only reserved for talking about spiritual matters. And I found myself using it in a very secular, non-spiritual way. And so even a word like holy, it's easy to, without thinking about it, be funny, be trite or trivial with a word that is a very, very sacred word and that should be really used in this only instance in a spiritual context. According to R.C. Sproul, there are 2 primary meanings, a primary and a secondary, but these are the 2 that most theologians agree on, that God's holiness is his transcendent majesty or otherness And number 2, his moral purity. Now, the first one, the primary meaning, transcendent majesty or otherness. What in the world does the word transcendent mean? I mean, we can't even understand the definition, much less understand the word. And so transcendent is that idea of transcending earthly boundaries. So we're saying that the holiness is referring to God's character or a nature that transcends everything that you and I can even begin to comprehend on a secular level, on a human, earthly level. The other part of that is his majesty is transcendent, that it's beyond the most majestic thing that we can think of. We love to think about the majesty of maybe the royal family in England, or the majesty of the Swan Mountains, or the majesty of particularly the mountains in Glacier National Park, the majesty of an ocean. You know, we've got a lot of reference points in our experience for the word majesty, but none of them are adequate. None of those pictures in our mind fully explain the holiness of God, because his holiness and his majesty transcends everything that we can think of that's majestic. And because of the majesty of him, of God, we can see his holiness. The other word that is associated with that very first definition, and I like it a lot, it fits for me. It's otherness. Okay, otherness. It's not even a word, okay? Otherness. It means that God is different from us. He is so different from us. Now, this presents a problem when we see that back in 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter is going to tell us, be holy. You be holy. You and I are to be holy just as God is holy. And we're like, no, God is other. In his holiness, he's other, he's different, he's transcendent. So how in the world can we be holy? Well, that's the lesson for next week. We'll get into how it relates to us next week. But for today, we just want to describe God's holiness. The secondary definition then is moral purity. And even though I haven't really gotten that far into next week's lesson, moral purity is where we're going to become involved in our understanding of the word holiness and how it relates to God, and then how he expects it to relate to us. Another author that I was studying this week says that the holiness of God is to use that one word to sum up all that God is. What are God's unique characteristics that are completely his, and we don't emulate them? We only receive the truth and blessing of them. So there are these particular characteristics of God that we can't share in. We can appreciate, we can observe them. Holiness is one of the ones that we will actually participate in. However, when you add all of the characteristics that are unique to God and put them all together in one basket, the summation of those characteristics, according to this one author, is his holiness. So the particular characteristics that are unique to God and that we cannot participate in are 10. There are 10 characteristics, and I'm going to call them out to you. If you're a note taker, please feel free to jot these down. The first one is that God is infinite. And the fact that he's infinite means that we can't measure him. We can't put him in a box. He has no limits, and yet we know that we do have limits, but he does not. So he is infinitely holy. His value is infinite, and that is how we view his holiness, as something that cannot be measured. The second one, that he is very related, but it's that he is incomprehensible. That means that we can't totally know and understand him. as much as we study the Word and as much as we get to know God and have experiences with Him, we'll never completely comprehend Him. I even think that as we die, go to heaven, be face to face with God for eternity, that we will spend eternity getting to know Him. Yet, He wants us to know Him. There are so many passages, I looked at quite a few last week, that are commands that He wants us to know Him. And He calls us to do the homework, to do the study, to investigate, to spend time in quiet, and just seek to get to know Him. So it is His desire that we know Him, but we go forward with that understanding that we won't ever completely know and understand Him. If we did, we'd be His equal, and that's not going to happen. The third thing after infinite and incomprehensible is self-existent. Self-existent, it means that nobody made God. He is God. He has always been. He was not created by somebody else, by some other God. He wasn't part of a big boom. He has always been, and He is self-existent. He exists of His own power. Self-sufficient is another word that describes God that is very unique from us. We are not self-existent and we are not self-sufficient. He is self-sufficient. He does not have a need that anyone else can take care of for Him. He is eternal. Similar to infinite, but not quite. I think eternal probably deals more with the nature of time, that He has no beginning, He has no end, He is the Alpha and the Omega, that He will outlast everything. He is immutable. Immutable means that He is unchanging. And that's really important for us to know in the year 2019, when we live in a culture where everybody's opinion is different, where the social and moral fabric of our society has changed so dramatically, even over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, I would not have been able to comprehend or imagine some of the things that are now the law of the land in America. So to know that God is immutable and unchangeable is to say, well, okay, we're changing. Our culture is changing, but God is not. And so that's very comforting to me to know that even though the culture is changing, I can count on the unchangeable character and nature of God, and that I don't have to try to fit into the culture. I need to fit in to the Word of God and be completely grounded in the unchangeable nature of His Word. The next word is omnipresent, and that's pretty clear what that one means. Omnipresent means that He is with us. He is everywhere, all at the same time. He can be in all places at all times. Sometime when you have time, read the 139th Psalm, because it speaks of God's ability to be in all places, and it's very comforting. Omniscient, it means that He knows everything. There is nothing that is hidden from Him. He is omniscient. He is all-knowing. He is omnipotent. Omnipotent, that means He is all-powerful. There is no power greater than His power. He has power to do anything. He is almighty and all-powerful. And then finally, the number 10th characteristic of God that He has that we do not share in is that He is sovereign. And that means He's in control. It's great to know that He has all power, but that power is very controlled power. So in His sovereignty, He uses His power to control events, to control all kinds of situations that happen all over the world that involve us. And that is a huge comfort to me when things look like they're going out of control, to know that He is in control. So as we look at that list of 10 characteristics that are unique to God, then we can, taking the statement of this author, I think it was John Piper that said this, that the holiness of God is to look at all 10 of those unique characteristics, and that is the totality of His holiness. That is how we can understand His holiness, is to understand those 10 characteristics. What I want us to do now with the rest of our time is to look at the holiness of God, the holiness of Jesus Christ, as seen in some examples in the Bible and some actual stories of things that happened in the Bible, and see how holiness, the holiness of God, is being expressed in these stories. The first one we're going to look at, the first two are really very difficult, because as human beings, we think differently than God does. And so this one's a little bit tough. The story's found in Leviticus chapter 10. Just 2 chapters earlier in Leviticus, we see that Moses has installed Aaron and his sons as priests. Aaron is the high priest, and his sons are commissioned to serve with him in the tabernacle. And they've been given very, very, very specific guidelines for how to operate within the tabernacle, in terms of how to present offerings, how to present sacrifices, how to put the sacrifices on the altar, and to scatter the blood of the animal, and to even to take the fire from the altar in a censer and pour it out. And so they knew what they were supposed to do, but in this story in Leviticus 10, they were, I guess we could say, they were casual about the guidelines. They did not follow the guidelines. They were careless in how they did this. And it tells us in chapter 10, that Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense. And they offered unauthorized before the Lord, contrary to His command. So fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died right there before the Lord. That is so difficult for us to understand. But what God is trying to say to us, and what He said to Aaron, the father of these 2 young men, is that His holiness is more important than anything else. And His holiness is so valued by Him that if anyone trifles or tramples or underestimates Him in His holiness, that He will deal with it. And that is a stern, stern warning to us today, that we not be flippant and careless in our worship of God, that we not make light of it, sarcasm, joking in any way, that as we come near to God to worship Him, that we are to worship Him in holiness and with great reverence. The second story, and again, this is difficult to understand, that it would require a man's sons' lives in this disobedience. But in another story, very similar, this is found many, many years, a few hundred years later. This would be 2 Samuel, and David is the king. King David is the king of Israel, and they have been defeated by the Philistines. And as they are, the Philistines, in their conquering of David and his army, they went into the temple and they stole the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was a physical symbol of God's holiness. It was the place where God resided on earth. It was like he resides in heaven in his throne room, but on earth he resided in the Ark of the Covenant. And so his heart was just breaking for the fact that the the Ark of the Covenant had been stolen by the Philistines. And so he went back to their territory in Gath to recover the ark. And they did it in such a way that was contrary to what the instructions Moses had given and passed down through the generations to the priests of how to handle the Ark of the Covenant. It actually had been designed with these rings on the corners of the ark so that no person touched it. It was, these rings had poles that you ran through the rings, and so the poles were what supported the ark as a man would carry maybe 4 people with a pole on their shoulder, and they would carry that ark from one location to the next when it needed to be moved. Well, it was not being done that way. It was placed on a cart, and an oxen was pulling the cart, and as the ox stumbled, a man that was walking alongside the cart, his name was Uzzah, he reached his hand up to catch it so it didn't fall, I guess, into the dirt. And when he did that, his anger burned. Let me read that. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Oh, once again, we read something like that and we're like, God, we can't understand that. We cannot comprehend how you would strike dead a person who mistakenly touches something that is representative of your holiness. But guys, we are not in a generation that thinks of God's holiness, and we have no excuse because we have God's holy word to explain to us about the holiness of God and all the different ways that we could disrespect his holiness. And so we know better. We cannot claim ignorance of the facts of God's holiness. We must fear God in his holiness. We must respect him in a powerful way. Now, let's go to the New Testament because we are seeing God's holiness in the New Testament through Jesus Christ. But it's a little bit different in the stories that we're going to read here. Stories that are familiar. The first one is the calling of the first disciples, specifically Simon Peter. We all know the story where Jesus calls out to Simon as Simon is coming in early one morning from a fishing trip. He's fished all night. Jesus says, "Hey, did you catch any fish?" And Simon says, "No, didn't catch any fish today." And I mean, Simon Peter was a fantastic fisherman. It was his profession. And, I'm sure it would be discouraging to him to not catch fish since it was his living. But he's a fisherman. He knows that you don't catch fish every single time you go out. And Jesus said, "Well, why don't you take your boat back out and throw the net on the other side of the boat?" And Simon's like, "Sir, we worked hard all night and we haven't caught a thing. But if you say so, I will let down my nets." And so the way it goes, he went back out. He did exactly what Jesus told him to do. And they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. And they were blown away. So they signaled for the other partners in the business to come and help them pull them in. But when Simon Peter, this is Luke 5, verse 8, when Simon Peter saw this incredible miracle, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Wow. What was it that Simon Peter saw and understood as a result of the miracle of this huge catch of fish? Was he blown away by the number of fish? Or was he blown away by this encounter with a man that he had only seen and heard about briefly, who had command of the fish of the ocean? What in the world must have been going through his mind? Who does these things? Who in the world is this man who is able to command fish to practically jump into my boat? And the response of his heart was, "I am an unclean man. I am a sinner. You are God. I am not." And so the revelation that God was able to give to him in the simple act of fish caused Simon to see the holiness of God as expressed in Jesus Christ. We have a very similar story and response, and a familiar story where the storm blew up on the Sea of Galilee as the disciples were trying to cross over the sea, and this is found in Mark 4, chapter 4, verse 41. And so this terrible storm comes up, a furious squall it's called, and the fact of the matter is Jesus was asleep. He was down in the stern of the boat, asleep on a cushion. Now, what does that tell you about somebody that can sleep through a storm with the boat pitching and rocking and rolling, and he's sound asleep? So they wake him up and they say, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" He rebukes the wind and the waves. He says, "Peace, be still, quiet." And then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He says to the disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And the response of the disciples is that they were terrified. And they ask each other, "Who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So think about it. Their response was not that, "Whew, we're safe. It's going to be okay. We're going to make it home tonight." That wasn't their response. Their response was, "Oh my goodness, who are you? You are in charge of all of creation. You tell the wind, you tell the waves what to do." And that pointed out to them the holiness of God as seen through the actions of Jesus Christ. So we see God's holiness in creation. We see God's holiness in worship. We see God's holiness in so many situations, but we just don't recognize it for what it is often. And so God is calling on us to seek Him in His holiness and to experience His holiness, even in our own lives. So to finish out this lesson today, we're going to spend some time in the book of Isaiah, chapter 6. Again, a pretty familiar passage to many of you, and it's one of my favorites. But it's a description of God and His holiness. This is Isaiah 6, 1 through 4. Actually, I'm going to read through 5. "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Above Him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory.' At the sound of their voices, the doorpost and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. This is Isaiah. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord God Almighty. Wow! Isaiah saw in a vision into the throne room of God, and he saw the holiness of God. And in these 5 verses, we see so many of the aspects of God's holiness. Just as we saw in those 10 characteristics of God that we mentioned earlier, that the combination of the value of all 10 of those describes God's holiness. Well, we're going to see some of that in this passage as we take it apart. And the first thing we see, that God is alive. King Uzziah is dead. Okay, King Uzziah was a good king. He was a godly king. He was an obedient king up until the last few years of his life. But he was dead. Okay, as Isaiah was seeing this vision into the throne room of heaven, he is announcing that King Uzziah is died. But guess what? God is not dead. God is seated on his throne. He is 100% alive. He's seated on a throne that tells us that he is authoritative. So we see he's alive. Again, looking at our list of 10 characteristics, he's infinite, he's self-existent, he's eternal, he's alive. He's authoritative, which we were saying earlier. He's omnipotent. He is sovereign. So he is authoritative. He's sitting on his throne, ruling the universe, really without even breaking a sweat. He has the authority. Now let me say that again. He has the authority. We don't give him authority. We don't say, okay, God, well, I'll acknowledge. Okay, yeah, I'll give you the authority over my life. No, he has authority over our lives. We might even push against it, but, that doesn't work out real well for us. If we push against his authority, we will come up against something for which we are no match. So our correct response to his holiness is to surrender to his authority. The next thing we see in this passage is that he is high and lifted up. That's, again, the word omnipotent that we saw earlier. He's high and lifted up. That means he has no rivals. His power is all powerful. He has all of the power. We tend to think sometimes that he has a rival called Satan or the devil, but Satan is just a pipsqueak. I like to think of him as a little tiny dog on a leash that is a retractable leash, and God is holding the controls of that. He is not God's rival. No one is God's rival. Daniel 4:35 says, he does according to his will in all the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand. No one can stop him. The next thing we see in this vision that Isaiah had was the train of his robe filled the temple. Now, the word that we're using to describe God in his holiness is resplendent. Resplendent, I don't know, it's not a word that we throw around a lot, but I think beauty and majesty might be associated with his resplendence. You think of the most resplendent bride that you've ever seen, with this long, beautiful train that follows her down the aisle. And it doesn't even hold a candle, no matter which Queen Diana or whoever it might have been that you remember seeing on television. But I think that the train of his robe filling the temple, as Isaiah is seeing it, for me, that is a picture. It's almost like a prophecy of how you and I will someday, when Jesus Christ reigns on the earth, physically on the earth, in his temple, that his resplendent majesty will be on display, and we will be able to see that. The train of his robe will indeed fill the temple. And then these seraphim that are in the vision that Isaiah has are very interesting. It's the only place in the whole Bible where seraphs are mentioned, but they're a type of angel. They're different from the warrior angels and the messenger angels. These seraphs are unique with 6 wings. 2 they cover their faces, and 2 they cover their feet. And of course they got to fly, so 2 they're flying with. But the fact that they're covering their faces and their feet suggests great humility, and suggests just worshiping at God's feet. And the song that they sing or say or speak is holy, holy, holy. It's like there's nothing else that in their vocabulary that comes close to describing what they are observing in the throne room, that God is holy, holy, holy. There are a few other verses that I want to just throw in here that I don't even have the address for them, but I think 2 of them are in Psalms. There is none holy like the Lord, there is none beside thee. To whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One. I am God, I am not man. I am the Holy One in your midst. So in the end, God is holy, and that in that he is God and not man. In the end, language runs out. In the word holy, we have sailed to the world's end in utter silence of reverence and wonder and awe. There may yet be more to know of God, but that will be beyond words. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Now, a couple more words back in our passage in Isaiah is that he is revered. You know, the foundations of the temple are shaking with the power and the majesty, and there's smoke filling the temple. And, you know, I'm about to finish this recording and go upstairs and watch the Super Bowl with John. And I think of events like Super Bowl football games that are these once a year events that are there's so much build up. You know, you think of all that's done to make it have as much bang for the buck as they can possibly get. You know, you can imagine the Blue Angels doing a flyover, and the sound of the roaring is like the breaking of the sound barrier. And you know, it just shakes your insides when you hear that. And so you think of the majesty of all of that. And in the temple of God, his holiness is just something that is so revered and so honored and so in such awe that the temple, the foundations of the temple shakes. The sound is just breaking the sound barrier. And so I think it's going to be the senses that we are going to use, our 5 senses and even beyond, when we see God in all of his glory and majesty and holiness, is going to be mind-boggling. No Super Bowl will ever rival it. And then finally, glorious, that God is glorious. Now, I learned something new this week, that glory is the manifestation of his holiness. Okay? So what that's saying, his holiness is the complete perfection of his divine nature, all 10 of those characteristics summed up together, his godness. So glory is God making his holiness public. Okay? It's like his holiness goes on public display and we see glory. We don't see holy, we see glory. Kind of mind-boggling, isn't it? John Piper said it this way: the holiness of God is his concealed glory. The glory of God is his revealed holiness. Isn't that mind-boggling? You know, here's the problem. why don't we see his glory much more often than we do? Is God not making his holiness public anymore? And so I started thinking about that. We see glimpses of God's glory from time to time. But I think what's going on is that there is so much going on in our world, so many distractions, that we can't see his glory for all of the busyness around us, all of the artificial frills and entertainment and distractions. And it reminds me of when we first moved to Montana in the 90s, early 90s. We discovered a road down in the Swan Valley that will drive, you can drive all the way up to trail number 7. And those of you who are hikers, you know that trail number 7 is that wonderful trail that goes the length of the Swan Mountain Range up on the ridge. And you can just go from Columbia Mountain all the way down to Swan Peak. But this location it's called Napa Point. And so you can take the Napa Point road, and it's rough. You got to have a very, very sturdy vehicle to do this, but you can drive all the way to Trail 7. And several times during those early years, our family would go up there in the summer, especially if we had heard that there was going to be a meteor shower. So we would take a picnic, and we would throw out our blankets, and John would build a bonfire, and we would either cook or just eat whatever we brought. And we timed it so that we would finish our food about the time it was getting dark. So we would clean up and put everything away before it got completely dark, and lie back on the blankets, waiting to see the stars. It's going to be this glorious show in the heavens. And one day it was like, I think it was Victoria that said, "Daddy, I don't see anything." And then he got up and took a pail of water and poured out the last little embers, poured the water on the last little embers of our bonfire, so that there was no other light. And our eyes began to adjust to the glorious majesty of the stars in the heavens. But we couldn't see the glory of God's creation in the heavens until we got rid of all of the artificial light. And I think that's our problem. We have so much artificial light, and I'm using that in a metaphorical way, that we have so much going on in our lives that distracts us, that we just won't take the time. We won't make the effort to pull away from everything that pulls us into this world, to allow God to show us his glory. He wants us to see his glory, but he wants us to not be distracted by other things, or we won't see it. So my challenge to myself and to each of you is to take the time, do whatever you need to do, to pull away and get that time to be with him, to be still and know that he is God in all the sum total of his godness, his holiness. I'll talk to you next week.